Do you want to add lettering to your slow stitching? What about adding a backing or connecting two slow stitched pieces together? Join me today as I stitch the word piece and slow stitch my collage, show two different methods to add a backing, and take two slow stitch pieces where the edges don't line up and problem solve to stitch them together. It all results in a beautiful textural scroll. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. Besides fabric and felt for the collage, today I'm using embroidery needles, 6-stranded embroidery floss, and I usually use 2 strands, some kind of pushing thimble, wonder clips, some cording, and a small iron. I'm also using a wood clothespin to wrap my scroll. I got mine on eBay. You will also need some straight pins. I've created a fabric collage, begun to stitch it down, and I've used a heat erasable pen to mark down some writing. To see how I got to this stage, you can check out my video on creating a fabric collage. I'm actually using the collage I created in that video today, and I'm going to be adding a backing to it. I'm going to be doing that later in this video. So back to this collage with the writing on it, I've chosen this bright pink color to stitch some lettering. I've taken an erasable pen and I've written out my word. I've made some adjustments in the letters so it's looking the way that I want it. Now I'm ready to start stitching. I'm using 2 strands of floss and I'm starting at the very bottom of the letter P, and I'm using the back stitch. So I'm going ahead of the last stitch that I took and coming back and connecting it. And I'm going to continue working my way around the letter this way. When I'm at a curve, I'm going to take really small stitches to create that round shape. And when I'm working on a straighter part, I can take a slightly larger stitch. Because the letter P has this rounded shape, these stitches are very small. So I take my time and I work back with that back stitch until I can connect it there at the very end of the rounded part. And I'm going to continue to stitch each letter this way. That P is looking good to me. Those small stitches have really helped to make that round shape. And now I can keep going with the next letter until I get to the very end. So I'm on my last letter here, just finishing off the edge of this E, and I like the way that that's looking. So now I'm going to come in with my small iron and put some heat over top of that stitching. I'm just going to hover it over top, and that's going to erase any of those blue lines. It's possible at this point, after erasing the lines, there might be a spot that you can see that you missed. It's very easy to go back and fill in that spot. This is looking good to me. Now I'm ready to do some stitching in other parts of the piece. You can see that I've already gone around each patchwork piece and I've secured down the edges with different colors of floss. So now I'm ready to stitch this piece, and I'm going to stitch it in one color. I have a longer video that goes into my process for stitching in one color, and I'll put a link in the description for that video. In that video, I stitch one piece in black, one in red, and one in off-white. This piece I could choose to stitch in black because there's some black in the background. I could use white because there's quite a bit of white in the piece. Red would also work, but it would be too close to that pink color I've used for the lettering. So I'm going to choose to use black today. I have 2 strands of floss and an embroidery needle. And really you can start anywhere. I'm going to start in the middle here by stitching around the word piece. So I'm going over top of the word with the running stitch, and then I'm turning and working my way back. I'm not going to stitch through the word, I'm going to stitch around it. I have the choice of lining up my stitches here or offsetting them. I think it's going to be nice to line them up here to create a nice stitched border around this word. So I create a few rows going down in front of that E, and then I'm going to go across to the other end and fill everything in. I'm normally a slow stitcher, and in this case I'm going even slower because I'm trying to create straight lines around this word. And it does take a little more time to line up those stitches one on top of the other. And I think it's worth it here because it's going to give a really nice effect. So I'm going to continue and fill in this area around my word piece, and then I'm going to continue with the running stitch in the other parts. I'm going to vary the direction of my stitches, doing several lines in one direction and then switching and stitching in the other direction. This adds a really nice variety. And you might notice that when I do these groups of lines and I switch the direction, I don't follow the patchwork in the fabric. I go over top of them, and this blends all the patchwork together. So I'm coming to the end here of all of my stitching. You can see how I varied the directions. I've continued with this idea of lining up the rows of my stitches because that's the way I started. So that's created a nice unity. So now it's time to think about the backings for these pieces. I'm going to turn first to my other piece that I created in a previous video, and the link for that is in the description. And I'm going to choose a piece of fabric that comes from these turquoise pieces that I'd used on the front. This is another area of that fabric. This fabric is thin and slightly stretchy. This is a recycled fabric. There's a lot of different designs going on here. I'm going to choose to use this upper portion that has all these swirling designs. So I'm going to cut a piece out of this that's slightly bigger on all sides. And the technique I'm going to use for this is sometimes called the pillowcase technique. I'm going to place both of these fabrics right sides together. I'm going to stitch around it and leave an opening and then flip it right side out. So I want to make sure that this doesn't shift too much and it stays in place. So I'm bringing out some straight pins and I'm going to pin everything in place. I'm going to leave an opening to turn this right side out. And one of the things I do to remind myself where to start and stop my stitching is to put 2 pins at my beginning and end points. This helps me to remember not to stitch over the area where I want to leave an opening. If I used a black thread to stitch this, it would be harder for me to see what I'm doing. And also, there's a chance that my stitches would be seen when I don't want them to. So I'm going to choose a greenish blue thread that matches my backing. I'm going to start at my double pin starting point, and I'm going to use running stitch all the way around to attach the backing to my collage. I'm working very close to the edge of my black felt, and the pins are helping to keep that backing from shifting. I have some thicknesses that I'm working through here, so I'm going to add a pushing thimble to my finger to help me get the needle through. I'm removing the pins as I go, and occasionally I'm flipping the piece over to have a look at my stitches to see if I'm catching everything. I've almost worked my way back to the point where I want to stop, so I can pull out my pins now. I'm going to take 1 or 2 extra stitches to reinforce the area where I'm going to be turning it. I'm trimming away the excess fabric, and I'm also clipping the corners of that fabric. This is a very thin, stretchy material, so it's not as important. And then I'm going to turn this entire piece right side out. So I use that opening, and I'm being very gentle, flipping out the piece, pushing those corners out with my fingers. I'm flattening the piece out, taking one more look at that corner, using my fingers to roll those corners, roll the edges of the seams to flatten everything out. There's my opening that I'm going to stitch closed. And before I do that, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I have an opening, and I'm going to go inside, and I'm going to stitch one spot where the fabric has not been caught, and I'm going to do some mending. So I'm going inside that hole with my needle so that my knot's on the inside, bringing my thread out. And in this one small spot, I'm going to take some extra stitches to stitch down that piece of fabric. All my fabrics are raw edge in this, but in this case, it's right at the seam where one small piece of fabric hasn't been caught. So I'm going to take a few stitches to catch those edges before they fray too much. And I'm ready to close that seam. I'm first going to take my iron out, give it a light pressing. Make sure I like the way everything looks before I close that seam. Then I can come in with a matching color of thread and stitch that opening closed. I'm tucking in the fabric and stitching it to that felt backing. I'm bringing my stitches around to the front. This isn't really going to be seen. And the color of floss that I've chosen is going to help those stitches be mostly invisible. They are going to show up a little bit, and they're going to appear to be very similar to the stitches that are on the collage around all the edges. So it blends quite well. Now this is something that's optional, and that is adding blanket stitches around the edges. After closing the seam, I came back with black floss and I went all around the edges, creating a blanket stitch. That's added a nice finishing touch to both the back and the front. That black thread matches the slow stitching lines on the collage, so it blends quite well. So this piece is complete, and I'm very happy with the way that it looks. So now I'm ready to move on to my second method of adding a backing. So I'm bringing back out my piece stitching, and I've chosen a piece of olive green fabric, and I'm folding in the edges. So along the long edges, I've already taken an iron, and I've ironed down that fabric so it is the right size for my piece, and I'm going to clip my corners. This is going to reduce some of the bulk when I fold in those ends. So I'm snipping off a small triangular shape at the corners where I've folded in those long edges. Now I'm going to fold up the ends. I'm going to start on the one side. I'm going to fold in that end and iron down that side. Then I'm going to unfold it, and I'm going to tuck in those corners and iron them, making that triangular shape. And because I've already cut out some of the bulk, that's going to help this area not be as thick as it would have been. Then I can fold it back up, and it makes a nice mitered corner. Now an optional step here is to find a way to keep this folded end in place. You could use glue or an iron-on adhesive to keep it in place, or you could stitch it. I'm going to stitch these down. I'm going to come in with some floss and just take a couple stitches right along those mitered corners to hold those pieces in place. Now I'm going to bring in my collage and start clipping it in place. I'm using Wonder clips to attach the backing. I'm going to use several clips here to hold it in place. So now that I have it where I want it, I'm going to finish my other side by folding in those corners. I'm going to hit them with the iron to help them stay in the shape I want. And then I can tuck that piece in. And I can clip that in place. And now I'm ready to stitch everything on. I'm going to hide my knot in my backing. You could use several different stitches to attach this backing to the front. I'm going to be doing the blanket stitch, but you could do a running stitch. You could do any kind of stitch to attach the one edge to the other. You could do a whip stitch or a mattress stitch. Because of the clips, it's actually a bit awkward to do the blanket stitch here. What happens is when you're creating that loop and pulling it through, it continues to get caught on the clips. So I just need to take my time. The ends and the corners Sometimes there's quite a bit of bulk. Even though we've cut some out, there's still quite a bit of bulk. So I just take care and go slowly, removing the clips as I go. When my thread gets short, I knot off, get a new piece, come up on the inside, and continue. As long as you catch that thread into the loop of your last blanket stitch, you can just continue in a really seamless way. I've worked my way around, removed all my clips, and I'm right at the spot where I started. So I'm going to attach my last blanket stitch to the first one, knot off, and clip my thread. So there's my backing with the folded in edges attached, and I'm happy with the way that that looks. So now I'm going to talk about attaching two slow stitched pieces. So I have these two pieces and they both have backings on them. So in themselves, they look quite complete. When I put them together, you can see that the piece on the right has an uneven edge. So one option is to place them right sides together and stitch them. And what would happen then when I unfolded it is this scroll would be a little bit uneven, which actually is fine. One solution to fix this uneven edge problem is to bring in another piece of collage. I think of this as a joining piece. So I've taken some of the fabrics that match this piece, or actually some of the same fabrics that I've used in both. I've created a really simple collage, and I've slow stitched in the central area in black, and I've left the outside edges unstitched. And what I aim to do is to use this piece to even up that uneven edge on the right piece. It will act as a nice transition between the two pieces, and it's going to bridge the gap between an even and an uneven edge. Now, if I was to take this joining piece, place it right sides together with the uneven side, stitch it, and then turn it out, I could then trim the outside edges of this piece to create even sides. If that was the case, I would probably start with a joining piece that's slightly bigger than both, so that would give me some ability to trim. The option that I'm going to use here is to partially lay this joining piece on top, covering up that uneven edge. So I lay it on top, and that bottom corner is covering the area that is uneven, and I'm going to stitch it on. So I'm choosing this green color that matches the back of my other piece. I'm going to hold this in place. You could also pin it or clip it. I think it's small enough here that I can hold it. I'm going to come up underneath with my knotted floss, 2 strands. I'm starting at the edge where I'm overlapping. I'm going to stitch using a stab stitch where I'm going right from the front to the back and from the back to the front, using straight stitches and attaching this from the bottom to the top. So here's the back. You can see how I've overlapped there at the bottom, and that has helped to even out that edge. The next thing I'm going to do is add a backing to this joining piece. This is a step that can be done later. It doesn't have to be done now, but I've decided to do it now before I attach the second piece. So I folded in the edges of this piece of green fabric. So I'm just going to continue and start here at this one side and stitch this piece on. You could go all the way to the front with this stitching, but I'm able to just stitch this going through the fabric and the felt without going to the front. So I stitch that all the way along, and now it's in place. It's not attached on the other side, just on this one side. And before I move on to my next step, I'm going to come in with some black floss and add 1 row of slow stitching. And that's going to bridge that little gap, and it's going to help blend these two pieces together. And I'm just holding that backing out of the way so I'm not stitching through it. And there's my row of stitching. Now I'm ready to add the second piece. So I'm doing the same thing that I did before. The only difference is that because I don't have an uneven edge, I can just place this piece on top of my joining piece and stitch the two together. I'm holding that little backing piece out of the way because I'm not ready to attach the other side. And I'm going to do the stab stitch again, where I'm going all the way from back to front to join these two pieces together. So now that piece is joined. It's looking really good to me. And I'm ready to stitch down that backing. I still have floss left and it's still attached from joining them. So I'm going to continue and go back in the other direction, just like I did on the other side. I'm stitching through both fabrics and the felt, and I'm not going through to the front, and I'm stitching that piece down. So there it is. That's looking good. So now I have raw edges at the top and bottom of my joining piece, but I want to add some stitching on those edges, and that's going to close the edges of that, and it's going to help join all those three pieces together. Because I've done blanket stitching previously, I'm going to continue with blanket stitching. I'm choosing black. I'm going to start with my joining piece. I'm going to start at the bottom and I'm going to stitch to the left, closing that in, and I'm going to continue all the way around the piece on the left. That piece doesn't have black blanket stitching on it, and I think it's going to be nice to add that to tie everything together. So I flipped this upside down here. You can see that I've started on this bottom piece, which is now at the top, with this black blanket stitching, and I've gone all the way along the bottom of this piece stitching, and I've gotten all the way up and around the corner. And I'm running out of floss, so I'm going to show how I stop and I start, because this is a situation where any knots that I make are going to really show. So I pull my thread to the back. I'm bringing out my needle just at the bottom of my last blanket stitch. Then I'm going to take a tiny knot and pull it tight, and that doesn't really show very much, so that's a really nice way to knot off. Then I'm going to take my needle down and I'm going to bury it underneath all that fabric and pull it out and pull that knot down as far as I can. I take a stitch in the other direction and bring out my thread. You can even do it a third time if you really want to make that knot secure. It's not necessary here, but just showing that you can do that back and forth with your thread, and it's hidden inside your piece. And there it is. So you can't really see where I've knotted off. Now I'm coming in with a new piece of floss. I've knotted the end. I'm going to go in right where I finished last time, and you may be able to pull on that and your needle will pop inside. Really depends on the piece you're working on and the bulks of the fabrics and so many different factors, whether or not you'll be able to pull that knot inside. In this case, I'm not doing that, so I'm pulling out that knotted end a bit so it's not tight against my fabric. I'm going to take 1 or 2 stitches, tiny stitches that won't show, to secure my thread. And then I'm going to start my blanket stitching. I'm going to take a couple of stitches, then I'm going to stop, and I'm going to clip off where that knot is that I've left sticking out on the edge. There's my little knot. I'm going to carefully come in and just snip that off. My thread is secure inside that piece, and it's not going to come out. This is sort of a variation on something that's called a waist knot that's used in embroidery. So now I'm going to continue with my blanket stitch and go all the way back and enclosing that last joining piece. So here it is completely stitched. My ends are enclosed. The 2 pieces are joined together with that third piece. I think that it looks very seamless. You can see on the back the 3 different fabrics that I've used. And I like that they're not all the same. Of course, you could use the same fabric if you wanted. I kind of like how the back shows some of my process. This scroll could either be complete or a work in process where I could add more later. I want to think now about how I'm going to store this piece. And I've decided that I want to wrap it like a scroll. This is a wooden clothespin. I bought a set of these on eBay and they were really affordable. This scroll is small enough that I could slip it into the opening of the clothespin and wind it. But I think I want to wind it around the entire clothespin. I like the way that that looks. I think that it needs some ties to hold it in place. I have this flat cording in this beautiful deep pink color. I think that's going to work really well to attach it to this clothespin. So what I want to do is snip off a length, maybe about 8 or 9 inches long, and sew that to the end of this scroll. I could sew this to the front or I could sew it to the back. Either way would be fine. I think I'm going to sew it to the back. I'm going to choose a color of floss that matches my backing. You can find the middle by folding your scroll in half. I'm going to come in with my knotted thread, place it right in the middle, snip off my end, and I'm going to hold that cording in place and stitch it on. This cording tends to fray. It's flat and it's braided. So I'm going to do a combination of going through the cording and around the cording, encasing it. I'm going to go back and forth until I feel like it's very secure. This is a contrasting color, so it's going to show up there on the back, which is fine. One option for covering up this stitched down piece of cording is to cover it with a piece of fabric. So I've taken a small snippet of this same fabric that's on this part of the backing. This is very thin fabric, so I'm going to actually fold it in half, and I'm going to place it over top of my cording. And that covers where I've stitched, and then I'm going to stitch that piece on. I'm going to go around it on all sides. And there, now you can see that that pink cording has been covered up with the fabric for a nice clean look. So now I'm going to bring back in my clothespin. I'm going to wrap that cording around and through that opening, and then I can wrap my scroll. I really like the way that that looks. I'm going to take another piece of that same cording and I'm going to wrap it around. I'm not going to stitch this one on, and that will give me the option to add to this scroll at a later date. So I'm just going to wrap it and tuck it in here. And there it is. I like the way you can see that black blanket stitching on the top and the bottom. I'm really happy with the way this has turned out. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this has sparked some ideas about how to finish your pieces, join them together, and create something beautiful. Until next time, happy stitching.